We're going to now demonstrate putting this approach to a full audit system in place. And as I mentioned, truth is this can be used with any kind of project we're using Entity Framework Core itself, right, for dealing with your database. Now, that would include, obviously, WebApi, as well as MVC applications and others. To do the demo, though, I've decided to use the MVC version of our medical office as the project to work on. Mainly because with the WebApi, although it's fully capable of implementing this approach to saving all the audit information, I want to as well be able to demonstrate pulling some of that out into some sort of a report on the screen. And that's much easier to do when I have a user interface to work with. So that's why I'm using the actual MVC version. Okay. So just recall, of course, that we already have basic auditing in place. We have our iAuditable interface and the Audible class. So anytime we want to implement basic auditing, all we have to do is on the model inherit from the Audible class, right? Good. Okay, that's good. But we want to go further. And that's going to involve adding at least one more new model. So I'm going to right click. We're going to add a class here. I'm going to call this model simply Audit. Okay. Now, not surprisingly, I don't think to anyone, first thing I'm going to have in here is your good old integer identity primary key, right? Then a little bit of a summary property here for the user, okay? That'll default to the user ID or the username if I actually have both, and so on and so forth. Okay. Then, of course, really just a bunch of strings, right? User ID, username, type. That'll be the type of entry that we're putting in here. Was this an update? And then eventually we might show it's an update of a given model, et cetera, et cetera. Might even provide further details in there as well. The entity name, of course, we need separate. The date time. Obviously, you got to have a timestamp on things of when this change actually took place, right? Whether it's insert, update, delete, or whatever. Then we have a bunch of strings here. Old values, new values, primary keys, foreign keys, right? So eventually they'll just be stored as strings, but peeking ahead, these strings are actually going to be JSON formatted collections of information. Okay. So the next class I'm going to add, now you could make an argument that this should probably be in view models instead, but I'm going to add it here in the models folder, in the models namespace as well, mainly because it acts so much as a bridge, right, between the actual audit class, which is in truth, the only one we actually saved to the database, and where we're getting all the information about the changes from. And that is our change tracking system, right? That's built into Entity Framework. And that's what we're really piggybacking on top of is the change tracking, right? So you'll notice here that in the constructor for this audit entry, I pass in one of these objects, okay? An entity entry. And that comes from, look at that, no surprise, change tracking, right? So we pass that in the constructor of the audit entry. And then, of course, we're going to have room to store all the different pieces of information. But notice this, okay? The key values, foreign key values, old values, new values, these are all actually dictionaries. Dictionaries, string object, okay? And that's how we get the actual information initially from the change tracker itself. But down further, notice what we're doing. As I said, this is like a bridge between the change tracking system and our actual audit class that we persist to the database. What we're doing down here is we actually have a method to audit, right? So from the audit entry, we can generate an actual audit object, okay? We pass in the key important time, the date time of when this happened, and we new up an audit. So all the information we're providing here is necessary, the user ID, the audit type, entity name, and so on, right? And there will always be a primary key. So I can right away go and get these key values, right? And then serialize it as JSON, okay? So that's this dictionary of object string, okay, the key values that came from the change tracker. We serialize it as JSON and store it in this string here inside of audit. Now, we always have a primary key, but we won't necessarily always have old values or new values or even foreign keys, right? It depends. So we'll put some logic here to make sure we don't try to serialize something that's null, okay? And if we actually have a count greater than 0, then for each of these dictionaries, we'll convert it to a JSON string. and store it in the new audit object that we then return. So you see what I mean? It really acts as a bridge between the two. Now, one other thing I'm going to add here right in the models folder is my own enumeration. I'm going to add a class here. I could worry about selecting the right type, but I'm just going to call it, and I'll change it in the code itself. What am I going to call it? I'm going to call it my entity state. Okay, because the change tracking system provides information about the different entity states of our objects that it's tracking, but they aren't particularly user-friendly, the names that are used. So I'm just going to basically do some casting of the entity state into my own enumeration so I can provide what I prefer to call friendly names for the different entity states: detached, unchanged, removed, updated, and added. So I can use this as required later on. All right, so that's it for adding in the models folder. Remember, again, this is the only one we actually persist to the database. So not surprisingly, the next thing we're going to do is come to our DB context. We're going to need down here an actual DB set, right, to store all this audit information in the database itself. Okay, so I'll create a DB set of audit objects. I'm going to call it audit logs. Now, we already have all this code here. Of course, that's our Fluent API, the on-model creating. And we override SaveChanges and SaveChanges async. Both of them call our on before saving, right? And this is where we actually handle the audit, the basic auditing, and so on. Okay. Well, I'm going to follow a similar parallel approach here, right? I'm only concerned about asynchronous. Okay? The only time we've ever used the non-asynchronous approach to saving data was in our seed data. So I'm just going to focus on the asynchronous SaveChanges audit. It will be the async. And I'm going to, though, break it out into a separate, in case I ever do want to handle it somewhat differently, a separate on before saving audit, right? So let me get the code for that. It's a bit more code, but obviously we have a fair bit of work we have to do to be as flexible as necessary to handle all changes to all types and shapes of data, right? I see the red underlining there is gone now because we've defined on before saving audit. Before we get into the nuts and bolts of this code, let me just emphasize this important point, right? The decision with a given entity, are we going to do full auditing, basic auditing, or no auditing? Well, basic auditing, as we know, all we have to do is inherit from Audible as a class, and that's looked after. We're going to make sure that still works, even if we go down this rabbit hole instead, right, of the full auditing. So how do we decide which ones get full auditing? It's simply a matter of deciding, are we going to call SaveChanges async, or are we going to call SaveChanges audit? So really it comes down to in the controller where you actually maintain data for a given entity, okay, say it's doctor or patient or whatever, right? Then when you call SaveChanges, if you call SaveChanges audit, then you will implement the full audit trail. Simple as that. Okay, let's get into the nuts and bolts here of our on before saving audit, right? As you know, it's all about the change tracker. So we call detect changes. That's it. Okay, now we're ready to actually start looking what were the changes and how are we going to actually track them and log them, so to speak. So we'll new up a list of audit entries. That's our bridging class that bridges between the change tracker, the entity entry we get there, and our actual audit object, right? I'm going to grab right away a timestamp. Okay, I'm going to using universal time code. For consistency, all the changes that we're tracking here, we're going to mark with the exact same time, right? Having a slight difference will only confuse things later on. So we're just going to stick with one consistent time for this actual save, you might say. Okay, then we have a for each loop to go through every entry in the entries in the change tracker itself. Now we have to do a bit of logic, okay? So if the entries, the entity is audit, okay, or if the state is detached, or if the state is unchanged. Well, we don't really care about it then, do we? Okay, so we'll just continue, right? We're skipping audit because we don't want to look for try to audit changes to the audit itself, right? That wouldn't make any sense. If it's detached, well, then we're not going to track changes. And if it's unchanged, our job is done. There's nothing really to say. Okay. Then the next thing we're going to do is handle basic auditing. Rather than try to call something up here from down here, right? It's easier just to have it in mind because we're just going down a different but parallel path, and we want to make sure the basic auditing is also looked after. So here's the check, right? If it implements the auditable interface, then it's trackable, and we're going to actually carry out our updated on, created on user assignments or data assignments as we go. Okay. All right. Now, we have a reason to track this, so we come down here. We new up an audit entry, okay? And we pass in the entry we got from our change tracker itself, right? So remember how that class works. It prepares and we'll be able to produce, okay, the actual audit object, right? But we're going to provide a little more information to it before we actually ask it to do that, okay? The next thing is the name of the entity itself, right? So we'll get the type of entity, okay, and we'll get the entity name, right, from that, the type of entity dot name, and that gives us our entity name property. Okay, now this next line of code down here is where I take the entity state and basically cast it using my own enumeration, okay, and with a toString to the audit type, right? So that'll change things like deleted to removed, a more user-friendly way to present it, and so on, okay? Of course, we need the username information, okay? And then we're going to go to the audit entries. We're going to add the audit entry itself, okay? And then for each property, okay, so the entry properties, we're going to loop through all of those, right? Now, from the property itself, using the metadata that's available, that we can get the name of the property. But for some of the decisions we're going to make later on, that's not enough, okay? So we're actually going to get the member info, okay, of the property itself, right? And so we'll go and get the property, identified by the property name, and this will give us the actual full set of information about all the metadata of the property. That'll come in handy later on when we want to do things like, does this property actually have, say, like a display name annotation, okay, or more detail on the type of property it is, and so on, right? Okay, now some of it we can get directly from the property using the metadata that's already provided. Is it primary key? All right, so now notice that there will be multiple properties that make up primary keys, so we'll just add each one. If as we go through we found another one that's primary key, no problem, okay? Then we just add it to the key values, and away we go. All right, is it a foreign key? There might be multiple foreign keys, no problem. As we loop through each one, if it's a foreign key, we'll take the current value and add it here to the foreign keys. Now this else branch, it wasn't a primary or foreign key, but that doesn't mean we're done. We have an opportunity at this point to say, okay, well, we might not care about display names for those because we don't usually bother with them for primary and foreign keys, right? But what if there is a display name, right? Well, here's where that extra member info comes into play, right? We can actually get the display attribute, okay, and that's the display name of the actual property itself. Then, if we don't have it, if there was no display name, then we'll just default back to using the actual name of the property. But, why not use it? If it's there, grab it this way and then use it. So here's something else that we're going to get from that member info, right? Does the property contain byte, okay? In other words, is it a binary large object, right? That's pretty important, right? Let me just press enter here so you can see it all on the screen at once, okay? If it's a byte array, then we need to know that, because if we're storing before and after values, we don't want to try and store that huge amount of data that makes up the byte array of a binary large object. Think of an Excel spreadsheet you've uploaded and saved in the database. Well, right, or an image, right? Whether it's a profile picture or whatever kind of image, right? No, we don't want to actually try to persist the raw data of that byte array, that binary large object, in the system itself. So now we can ask if, okay, as long as it's not a byte array, then we're going to actually persist the old values, new values, etc., right? Okay. So depending on the entity state, if it's added, right, then we just add the current value here to the new values, right? If it's deleted, we add it to the old values. If it's modified, we add it to both, right? Obviously, if you just added it, there won't be old values. So the current value just goes in new values. Same thing for if you've just deleted it, okay? There are no, there's old values, but there's not new values. So we just store it in the old values. It's only if we've done a modification, if we've edited the record, would we have both old and new values to save. And that's it, okay? So we actually finally have our audit entries all put together. So we just loop through them, okay? And in each of them, we call the to audit, okay, passing the time, right? So we're consistent. It doesn't matter how long this code took. We're using the same time for all of them, and we add them to the audit logs. So, of course, that will all get saved or persisted to the database. All right. Good. So that's it. We're ready to go, except, of course, obviously, we're going to need a migration. Okay, so let me come up to my common commands, grab this little bit of code at the very least, and come to our package manager console. Okay, and maybe call this migration full audit. Hopefully I build. Hopefully. Oh, yeah, that's good. Build succeeded. All right, so you see all we're doing is creating the audit log table to store all of our audits. The down would just be to drop it, so that's good. So the migration's all there, ready to go. I'm done with that. Let me just, before I go on, double check the settings I have in my program.cs here, right? Way down at the bottom here, where I prepare to see the database and so on. Delete database, yeah, I don't need to delete it. I just want to make sure use migrations is set to true, right? So yeah, we're good. And I can leave a seeding sample data. That's not a problem. I can leave that just fine. So let me go ahead and run it. Now I'm going to do something a bit wrong to drive home a point, right? So let's come in, I'll log in. We'll come in here to a patient. And I'm going to, I don't know, pick a patient, any patient. I'm going to pick this one here at the bottom of the list. All right. Yeah, so I can see all the data here. Let's actually do an edit. So Vivian, middle name is Norma, and I don't know, I'll change this as well, maybe add asthma, things like that. Click Save. Okay, so did we actually audit that information? No, we didn't. Why? Well, let me show you. Let me come down to our tool here for our SQLite, our compact toolbox. Okay. Okay, let me just make the connection here to our database. Look at the tables. Look, there's our audit log table. Let's have a peek inside. Wah, 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 wah. Nothing there, right? No data was actually audited. Why not? Well, remember what we said, okay? Back in our DB context, we changed it so we now have a choice, right? What are we going to do? Let me bring over my copy-paste file here on the screen. Basically, in the controller, for any entity that you want full audit of all changes, change our calls from SaveChanges async to SaveChanges audit, right? So I could do, if I wanted to, right, I could track changes in all entities. Okay, I could just do a global search and replace of this line of code and replace it with SaveChanges audit, right? Now, I don't necessarily want to do that. For one thing, I had suggested that for practice, you put in place auditing for doctor, right? So to avoid that issue, let me come back up here to controllers. I'm going to focus on patient. So I'm going to want the patient controller, right, for sure. But I also want the patient appointment controller, because I also want to do appointments. So I want the appointment controller. And I'm not going to track appointment reason changes there. Condition controller is probably a good idea because we want to track that as well. And that should probably take care of it, okay? So with those open, I'll do Control H. So I'm going to replace, okay, await SaveChanges async with await SaveChanges audit in open documents. Just those 4 controllers. 9 occurrences. Bada bing. Okay. Good. All right, so let me just run again now. Log in. Pick a patient, any patient. Oh, by the way, one reason why I made sure I did the patient appointment controller, remember when we click on the details link here for a given patient, watch the URL at the top. Okay, we're no longer in the patient controller, we're in patient appointment. This is technically the index, right, of the patient appointment. And we're using it as if it's the details for a patient, but that's how we set up this master detail page for this one-to-many between the patient and the patient appointments. Okay, so I'm going to do a few things. Actually, let me come back here. I'm going to make a few changes. Oh, the OHIP number, we had that wrong. They haven't been well lately quite a bit, so we're going to bump up the expected visits per year. I'm going to, you know what, we don't need them in this medical trial anymore, but we're a little bit afraid of that, so we're going to add them to the leukemia trial. I don't know, I'm making stuff up. Sorry. I'm just going to change the doctor to Charles Xavier. Let's check off a few additional conditions in their medical history, right? There we go. All right, so I'm going to save that. So here we are. We've made some changes to this particular patient. Ooh, let's modify an appointment as well. Okay, so the reason for this, no, it wasn't an accident. It was actually illness, and we didn't charge them a fee after all. There we go. Oh, so I want to change the doctor. Yeah, we had the wrong doctor down. They actually saw Lucy here, Lucy Hightower, that doctor, when they came for that. Anyway, that's enough. That should be enough changes. So let's stop running. Let me come back here just to do a quick refresh. And if we come back to our table again, have a look inside, there we go. Now I'm finally seeing some data here, right? So we see we have the user ID. Well, that's the email of the logged in user, okay? I haven't got the username because we haven't actually gone as far as pulling that out of the cookie, right? Here is the type, added, updated, right? The entity name, okay? The patient, the appointment, and so on, right? And here we get into all those JSON strings. Now notice that these only contain, okay, piece of information about what changes were made, right? So the old values, the old value was Dr. ID 8. If we scroll along, get to the new values, see the Dr. ID is 3. So now we can compare the old value to the new value, depending on how we pull this out and display it on the screen, right? So only the properties that were changed are listed here. So here is the bottom one is that appointment that we updated, right? Now it's a little different. Notice it has all the information, even for things that weren't changed. That's because it's not the main entity itself. So we had no choice but to include them all. But don't worry, I'll show you later on in your reporting, you can decide, hey, if a value hasn't changed, we don't need to actually put it out to the screen. Very important. Look at this, how the keys are handled, right? The primary key here, this would be the primary key of the appointment. The primary key of the actual patient is this here. But notice as well, okay, in the foreign keys, we have information here. Look at it, foreign key for this appointment, that's where we're going to have the patient ID. Notice it's the same value as shown here, patient ID 139, right? This appointment is patient ID 139, okay? That's the foreign key of the actual keys, in the foreign keys of the actual patient itself, right? So it gives you an idea right away now. If we want to go to this table, this one magical table that has all this audit information in it, and if we want to pull out information about all the changes related to a given entity, let's stick with patient as our example here, I'm going to have to search for the patient ID being referenced in either foreign keys or maybe in primary key. Of course, see, with all these conditions that we added here, it's always in there. But you know what? Sometimes it's not mentioned in either key. Sometimes it's actually mentioned in old versus new values, right? For example, you know, say it was doctor. If we were looking for information about affecting a doctor, well, the doctor ID is referenced here for the patient in the old values and new values, right? But nowhere else. So we end up having to search for information about the entity we're focused on, in my case here, patient, in any one of those 4 areas, right? Now, of course, if we're looking in primary keys, it will have, this kind of format, ID 139, right? But in foreign keys or anywhere else, it'll probably have the format, as long as we're following that naming approach, naming convention we talked about earlier, having the entity name with ID at the end, okay, for the foreign key name, then we would have to search for that in these other areas. I'm taking time to talk about that so you can understand the link query that's coming up in a little while when we go to pull data out of this table. Okay, all right. So yeah, let's make a little bit more of a change here. I could play with a different record, or I could keep on working in the same one. It doesn't really matter. Maybe I'll do something in the same person. Let's go in, let's add a new appointment altogether, right? Duration, let's change that to a 40-minute appointment. Help with nerves. Okay. We're going to have a big extra fee here. Reason for the appointment was a mental state. Okay. And the doctor was, I don't know, Gregory House. Sure, why not? So we'll create a new appointment as well, right? So that'll just give us more and more data to work with when we get to reporting. Maybe I'll play with a separate one as well. Let's edit this patient. I don't have to make extensive changes. I'll just maybe change the doctor, add a couple check boxes, save that. Oh, you know what? That reminds me. I'm going to go back again to that first patient we played with and edit them. I could have just clicked the edit link. No, they've never had a bleeding disorder. That was a boo-boo. So I want to take that checkbox off. All right, so we have all that data. And sure enough, I could go and look in here and refresh this again. Look at all this information that we're storing about. See, here's an example of this patient, the doctor ID 7, so that change was there, and so on and so forth. We removed a patient condition, right, and things like that. So notice that, of course, we don't actually have the name. We just have the IDs stored in the audit trail. So we're going to have to do some work in the reporting mechanism to show all that information. All right, but we're getting it all saved, and, you know, if we were doing a web API, all the same code basically used in pretty much the same way would look after storing all the audit information about those changes. But as you can kind of see already, to actually get all that information up in a nice user-readable format is going to take some work as well. So I'm going to stop the recording at this point. Then we'll get into displaying this history data in the next part.